Before the Second World War, humans had been slowly whittling down the populations of animals living in the U.S., fueled by illegal hunting and under-the-table fur trades. Even the populous alligators in the Everglades were nearly wiped out, and sightings of the mighty buffalo were becoming so rare that you might as well have been out looking for a unicorn. But the end of the Second World War brought an end to most of the senseless killing, both of humans and of animals. New laws and better policing of the national parks gave the animals who called the wilderness home a chance to recover. Now there are more alligators, buffaloes, deer, elk, wolves, and mountain lions than ever. Only the wolves and buffaloes are still playing catch-up, but the rest of the endangered species are no longer at risk at all. It truly is remarkable what we've accomplished in these past years. Rocky Mountain National Park is one of these protected places. It's teeming with wildlife, and people come from all over the country to see them. But with rising populations also comes greater risk, especially when people continue to move deeper and deeper into the wildest areas where predators roam free. In July 1997, a female mountain lion was out on the prowl. By now, she was an experienced hunter and often took down heavy game like deer. But her progressing pregnancy was starting to make movement difficult for her. The big game was no longer an option. Even the old bucks and small calves that were usually easy pickings were always surrounded by younger and stronger deer with heavy hooves. With her limited mobility, those hooves could be the death of her, or at the very least, the death of her cubs before they were even born. She needed a few decent kills to sustain her for the first few weeks after she gave birth. She wouldn't be able to leave the den that she'd already prepared for her upcoming litter during that time. Whatever she could kill in the next few days had to be enough to give her sufficient strength to give birth to her cubs and also to be able to produce milk for them. She'd spent the last week attentively observing her surroundings, formulating a new plan of action. It needed something bigger than the small game that had been supplementing her, but not too big to pose too much danger. The mountain goats were still too big, and they came with murderous horns, but the rodents and hares weren't big enough to offer much sustenance. And then there were the humans that frequented the mountain lion's home. They were loud, and sometimes they carried metal sticks that made more noise than the cat had ever even heard before. Those strange sticks could bring down a deer with a single blast. The humans seemed like a good upgrade from rodents, but they were rarely out on their own, always surrounded by other human companions. Still, the smaller ones were a very good option to go for, but only if she could catch one as it wandered away from its pack. When it fell asleep the night before, the cat was mulling the details over in her mind, and by the time it woke the next morning, she had formulated a plan. And right as it predicted, like every morning, the small groups of humans came into the wilderness at the crack of dawn. Small families, large groups of friends, and pairs of lovers drifted into the wilderness at the early hours of the morning. Most of them walked the trails to Cascade Falls. The waterfall was the main attraction of that part of the park, and it was so well traveled that animals big and small avoided drinking water there at all. Instead, they preferred to go downstream a few miles to avoid the people altogether. The cat watched several groups go by, waiting until a band of humans came in that had smaller ones with them. It honed in on a group of 5 and followed them into the trees. She stayed far behind them, watching to see if it could get lucky enough for one to finally break free from the rest. The group had 3 adults and 2 children in it. The mountain lion was keeping an eye on the 2 smaller ones. The Miedena family was completely unaware of the fact that they were being followed the moment that they stepped foot in the forest. Kathy and David brought their 2 children, 6-year-old Rose and 10-year-old Mark, for a day out in the woods. With them was a friend and colleague of Kathy's. Kathy was a registered nurse, and her friend Dina was the receptionist at the hospital where they worked. Chatting and strolling leisurely along, the group stopped frequently for snacks and bathroom breaks. Mark had a bag of peanuts to nibble on as he walked, but he didn't eat any of it. Instead, he dropped them on the ground, one by one, making a little trail for them to follow when they turned back. His imagination ran wild as he laid down the trail of peanuts. His thoughts were full of Hansel and Gretel and their breadcrumbs, pirates following the dotted lines on their treasure map. He was creating his own little adventure with only peanuts and the power of his child mind. This imaginary world was a lot more fun than listening to his mother and Dina complain about work anyway. About 3/4 of the way to the falls, Mark's peanuts ran out, but he looked back at the line of nuts behind them with satisfaction. If the birds and squirrels didn't notice it, then they'd find his perfect dotted line on their way back, like a real treasure map, with the car in the parking lot being their treasure. Meanwhile, from the shadows, the cat was still watching. Every time Rosie or Mark stepped into the bushes to relieve themselves, the feline in the shadows inched forward. But every time, just as she thought that the children were in her grasp, Kathy or David stepped forward to keep them in their sights. For the first half of the trail, all the way to the falls, the female targeted only Rosie. She was the smallest of them all, and surely the tiny child would be the easiest one to bring down. But the little one spent her time on her father's back or holding her mother's hand, practically attached to her parents' hips. The predator was properly tired by the time the 5 of them reached the falls. It had been hours of stalking, just to be interrupted by one of the adults every time. But she'd at least remain hidden in the brush, staying just far enough to remain out of sight. The Miedenas and Dina still had no inkling that they were being actively hunted in broad daylight. At the falls, the animal moved in closer, her movements masked by the running and crashing of the waterfall. She was so low to the ground that her swollen belly skimmed the forest floor. She knew that the day had already dragged on so long that if she gave up her stock, she probably wouldn't eat at all, so she stayed on, for now, just watching them. She was so desperate that she was even willing to try for one of the adults, as long as at least one of them wandered away on their own. That's when the other smaller one caught her eye, drawing her attention away from Rosie. The boy was bigger, sure, but he seemed the most likely to find his way out of his parents' reach. Mark was darting about with endless energy. At first, he splashed his feet in the water. Then he ran and climbed on a fallen log. After that, he and his father chased each other over the rocks. And finally, he made one more trip to the water line, picking up small stones to throw into the stream. He was a lively, happy, and active child, like almost every other boy his age. Mark's bubbly personality even brought out a little more adventure in his sister Rosie, who was much more reserved and shy. If anyone was going to explore on his own, it would be Mark. He was the cat's next target. After a quick bite to eat and a long drink of water, the group started heading back down the trail. Mark kept his eyes on the ground for the first hour or two, trying to spy on a peanut. He started to think that the rodents had found his trail after all, and his little heart sank with disappointment. But not for long. Just when he'd given up hope, he saw the near-perfect line of treats start up where his bag had run empty. With an exciting whoop, he ran forward, intending to follow the peanuts all the way to the car. David smiled. He'd been aware of what his son had been doing with his bag of snacks, and instead of telling Mark off for wasting food, he allowed him to have his fun. That's what the woods were about, after all, making your own adventures. So he let Mark run ahead, knowing he'd stay on the trail where the peanuts were. The lion that had been sneaking behind them quickened her pace when the boy raced away from his parents. Just ahead of the trail, there was a bend that would obscure him from the 3 adults. If she got there quick enough, she could cut him off and have him out of there before the others even caught up to Mark. Silent and quick, she used the rocks and fallen branches to avoid stepping on noisy, dry leaves. She sprinted past Mark, so close that if he raised his eyes from his line of peanuts, he'd have seen her. But he was utterly focused and didn't catch the brown blur that passed by ahead of him. As Mark ran further away from his parents, David called for him to slow down and wait for them. But Mark wasn't listening. When his son disappeared past the curve in the path ahead, David sighed and jogged forward, leaving his wife, daughter, and Dina behind to catch up with Mark. By the time Mark turned the bend, the feline was already in position, and David was still many yards behind them. Crouched behind some bushes, she heard the thump of the bigger man's steps as he jogged closer. She'd spent the whole day being patient. This was her best and probably her only chance to get at the child. If she didn't act now, she'd be hungry for another day. Then Mark ran by, his head still down, looking for more peanuts. The predator leapt at him. The weight of her belly barely slowed her down when she was airborne, thanks to the incredibly muscular legs that propelled her up and forward. Mark saw the movement and jerked his head up. With claws already extended and her body arching through the air, the mountain lion fell on him. The 88-pound cat crushed him into the gravel path. Mark opened his mouth to scream out, but the cat already had its teeth around his throat, closing his airway and blocking any air from passing over his voice box. Her claws enveloped him, digging trenches into his back. Piercing pain ran through Mark's skinny frame. His neck and back felt like they were on fire. If he could have gotten a sound out, he would have been screaming in agony and terror. The mountain lion increased her grip on his windpipe, and Mark heard the snap of his neck reverberate inside his head before his vision switched off and he suddenly went limp. The mountain lion knew instantly that the child was dead. His muscles went completely placid beneath her when she felt the crack of his neck between her jaws. From behind the bend, the sound of sneakers hitting the path was almost upon her, so she released her hold on Mark and grabbed him by his dark hair instead. She dragged his body off the path and into the bushes that she'd just leapt out of. But before she could get the boy out of sight, the father came around the corner. His sneakers came to a sudden halt when he saw his only son being dragged across the trail by the huge predator. She met his eyes, and her gaze brought David out of his shock. With a scream of terror and sorrow, David stormed at the lion. Thoughts of his own safety didn't even register with him. Only the life of his son mattered now, no matter what the monster was that had Mark in its claws. The cat did not expect the man to reach them so soon, and she certainly didn't expect him to make the noise that escaped his mouth. The next moment he rushed at her, startling her enough to make her let go of Mark's scalp, taking a patch of skin and brown hair with her as she turned her clumsy body around and fled into the trees. David's screams alarmed Kathy and Dina, and they ran down the path, leaving their conversation hanging in midair. Rosie was riding on her mother's hip, and she held on for dear life when her mother suddenly sprinted forward. Kathy found David crouched beside the terrible sight of her young son lying bleeding on the ground. And even with all of her medical background as a nurse, she knew that the severe angle of his neck meant that it was too late. She still ran forward, shoving Rosie into Dina's arms. Kathy ripped David's shirt right off his back and wrapped it around Mark's torn-open neck, but the blood no longer flowed with the steady pump of a heartbeat. It just seeped out steadily. While Kathy attempted CPR and applied pressure to her boy's neck, Dina was already running ahead with Rosie bouncing on her hip. She found a group of mountain bikers less than a mile ahead, and they rode in to get some help. But by the time Dina returned, Kathy and David were sitting numb with horror, no longer struggling to bring Mark back. They eventually realized that there was nothing they could do for Mark, with a broken neck and the gashes on his throat. Both wounds were fatal on their own, and he was starting to lose his body heat and develop that unmistakable gray tinge to his skin that came with death. For the next hour, they sat waiting for help to arrive. Dina held Rosie's head in her hair to spare the child the sight of her dead big brother. The bikers had managed to find 2 park rangers, and they rode their off-road Jeep to the scene. One of them stayed behind while the other escorted Kathy, David, Dina, and Rosie back to the lot to await emergency services that were already on their way. The man who stayed behind took off his jacket and placed it over Mark's remains. He couldn't handle looking at the child's blank eyes and the raw wound on his neck a second longer. Mark's body was removed from the scene, and searchers went out to look for the mountain lion. It took a professional tracker 3 days to find her. The cat was killed with 2 bullets and taken in for an autopsy, though no one expected any of Mark's remains to be in her system, given that she'd only managed to tear away a small piece of his scalp. But they did find the 2 cubs inside her belly. probably only days away from being born. But with the child's killer dead, the family could begin to heal after their only son, Mark Miedena, met his terrifying final affliction.